Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the IETF. I'm Scott Bradner. I'm going to give this introduction to the IETF. I've been hanging around since early 1990. The IETF goes back a few years before that, but I started around then. The agenda, talk about a little bit of the history, then what the IETF thinks its role is and what others think their role are. Some of the IETF structure and groups that are affiliated with but aren't necessarily the IETF itself, but are actually pretty important to the IETF. How do we get managed? How does the IETF manage itself, and how do we select the managers? Something about the process. Tell you about what the working group sessions that you're going to be seeing this week are going to be like, and then talk about intellectual property rights. Not because that's a wonderful topic, but because it's a necessary topic. So, the IETF was formed, if that's the right term, started to organize, started to meet in '86. It was sponsored by the U.S. government, but it was really just a group of people getting together. They were getting together initially before the IETF was formed to do further development on the ARPANET protocols. There needed to be some home in the U.S. government for that. So we got funding from the U.S. government up until 1997. But since then, it's no U.S. government involvement. And even before then, the government wasn't sponsoring us in the sense of giving us a charter or anything else like that. It was simply they were providing some funds. They did not provide any kind of direction or authority for us. For most of its existence, the IETF has been considered to be irrelevant, and that has been wonderful. Because if you're not relevant, then nobody worries about you. The thing that you know is the internet developed out of a lot of people not believing that it would work. Back in the early days, IBM refused to bid on the contract, the U.S. government contract for the first router, because they didn't see any future in packet networking. AT&T literally laughed at the first demonstration in 1972 of the ARPANET. They literally laughed. And that was wonderful because the powers that be didn't care. And that meant we could go off and do what we wanted to do rather than being directed to do what the public good would be or whatever. We could do what we wanted to do. So we're not government approved. We were not government approved then. We're not government approved now. We don't pass our standards off to somebody else to say, is this okay? We just do them. The IETF is people. It's not companies. If you get up on the microphone and say, I'm from Cisco and Cisco thinks, you will be laughed at because everybody knows Cisco doesn't think. Companies don't think. People think. So literally, somebody will give you a hard time if you say you're from some company and that company thinks this or that company has that opinion. That's not what we're here for. We're here to find out what you think. And if you can't articulate why this is good, the fact that you've got a big company, billions of dollars in something who might want it because of some product strategy is irrelevant. Because you have to convince the people here of the technical merit of what you're talking about. So this is people, not companies. This is a quote from Dave Clark, 1992. Reject King's precedent in voting, we believe in rough consensus and running code. It's a very important, fundamental description. Before 1992, the IETF hierarchy management was hereditary in a sense, and that there was some people that were appointed as leadership, and they chose the other leaders. They chose the other management. In 1992, that changed. It completely changed. And now it's all bottoms up. All of the management of the IETF is chosen by the folks involved in it. We don't have any voting. Since the IETF actually doesn't legally exist, we don't have any way to define what a constituency would be. And if you don't have a way to define what the constituency would be, you can't say what voting would be, because you don't know who would vote. So we have to do some other way of trying to figure out whether it's a good idea. We'll get to that. The things that we believe in are rough consensus and running code. Not so much the running code as we used to, but it's still, we sort of like it. Rough consensus means we don't go for consensus in the normal traditional standards body way of everybody being equally dissatisfied. We have an environment where if some percentage of the community really thinks this is a really stupid idea, but the rest of the community likes it, or doesn't express an opinion, it'll move forward. The squeaky wheel doesn't get their funnily shaped thing into the standard. Well, we try for that. It doesn't always work. We try for that. So that's the basic IETF. Our mission, if we have one clean one, is to be the home for the Internet standards process, the Internet standards, the Internet technology. Most of the IETF, most of the Internet standards were Internet technologies, either were formed in the IETF or are maintained by the IETF. A lot of the basic technologies, like the Internet protocol itself, TCP, IP, etc., predate the IETF by a long shot. But we're the maintainers of them. We don't worry about the wires, the physical wires. That's somebody else's problem. We'll get to that in a bit. Also mentioned already, the IETF has no legal existence in and of itself. It is an organized activity of the Internet Society. And we voluntarily became that. Back before the mid-1990s, we didn't admit the Internet Society had been formed, but the IETF said, well, what have you done for me lately? And we don't want to necessarily associate with you because we think that you're actually going to steal our glory. Well, it took a number of years, but finally the IETF agreed to come under the wing of the Internet Society, but we're still not a separately organized or incorporated entity. It's just there. It doesn't legally exist. This caused some very funky things to happen over the years when some big fancy international standards body wants to sign an agreement with the IETF. There's nobody to sign it because there's no legal entity. So for a long time, the Internet Society signed for us. But now most of those bodies realize maybe the IETF doesn't exist, but it sure has a presence. And they allow the IETF to sign on its own, even though there's no legal basis for that. Organized activity in the Internet Society. We get 1,000, 1,500 people at these meetings, the ones you're at right now. Hugely more on the mailing list. The primary work under the IETF is done on mailing lists. We've got about 126 working groups. That was the time when I made up these slides, when we updated these slides. That's where the work is done. Working groups in the IETF are almost always bottoms up. Occasionally, but it's very rare, that the management comes along and says, I want a working group to do this. Mostly it's done from the bottoms up, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. The working groups are organized together into areas for managerial efficiency, or at least managerial complacency. Whether it's efficiency or not is a real question. The ops area, the general area, operations and management, the RI area, real-time interactive area, routing, security, and transport services. The boundary between the areas is quite fuzzy. Working groups are in one area or another depending on the interests of the area directors, not necessarily because of the particular technology. Sometimes it's clear. There's some pure security things which are clearly going to be in the security area. But other things, they're fuzzy. They might go into some other area depending on what area directors got. The people that propose the working group, who do they persuade to reveal a good idea? Each area is managed by 2 area directors, except for the general area, which is a special case. Those area directors seated as a group make up the Internet Engineering Steering Group, the IESG. The IESG is the standards approval body in the IETF. They do a thorough, in theory, sometimes too thorough, technical review of proposals. Cross-area technical review. I'll come back to that. That's a very important thing. There is the Internet Architecture Board. That used to be called the Internet Activities Board when the IETF was first formed, because it was the activities of the Internet they were controlling of it. But they got a little bit big for their britches at one point. They were the standards approval body for the IETF, and they just went a little too far without the community behind them, and the community overthrew them and gave that assignment authority to the IESG and took it away from the IAB. The IAB is still there as an architectural advice body and the body which works well, external liaisons. The IETF's relationship to other bodies such as the ITU is done through the IAB. The IETF produces standards and other documents. So what's a standard? Back in the mid-90s, the then chair of the IAB and I were at the ITU, International Telecommunications Union in Geneva. And this was when the ITU was just thinking that maybe this internet thing had a future. They weren't sure, but they thought maybe it did. And so Brian and I got up and we gave a talk on what the IETF was. Basically this talk, but a little tweaked for their particular sentiments. And so we gave the whole talk. The very first question that was asked at the end of the talk was, how can you call your things standards if no government mandates their use? Well, there's the difference. We produce something, we call it a standard. You may look at it and say it's garbage and ignore it. You may look at it and say, that's really good, I'm going to use it. If enough people decide the latter and decide to use it, hey, that's a standard. But we don't have any standards police out there. We don't have anything out there that says, you must do this. We have some musts and shoulds in the document that says, if you want interoperability, then this is how you have to do it. But we don't tell you you have to run this. Whereas some of the other standards bodies have regulatory might behind them, which requires service providers in their territories to actually use a particular standard. We don't do that. No government requires the use of the IETF protocols. Well, some sort of like them, but they don't have the same kind of regulatory authority. So we don't have any formal recognition of these things. They're not part of a international or formal standards body. Though we are an international informal standards body. We very much believe that we are a standards body. Governments don't approve these standards, and some people think, mostly folks outside the IETF, but some people think that the lack of government recognition is a problem. Government should be able to control things like this. The head of the U.S. House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich, once said that it was part of government's responsibility to guide technology. Well, we don't like that kind of guidance, so we don't kind of accept that. But other governments like this. One of the problems with the internet has been is from the point of view of traditional regulatory authorities and government, is that it's completely chaotic. They have no idea what's going to succeed. Somebody comes up with a standard through the IETF on their own, and maybe this thing is the next Facebook, maybe it's the next Facebook after the IPO, maybe it's who knows what it is. You don't know. You can't bank on it. You can't predict it. You can't decide what to invest in other than your own brain power to deciding that's a good idea or not. And that level of chaos is a bother to a lot of regulators. Virginia Prostrel wrote a book called The Future and Its Enemies. And in that she said, one of the enemies of the future are the people who fear chaos. Because if you fear chaos, then you're fearing this kind of standards where you can come up and decide this is a good technology, and you can get the right people around you to work it through the process, make sure it's technically competent. You can put it out there without any government saying that's a good idea. And that's a very important thing. So, what is the IETF? I said it already. It's Internet standards. Traditionally, this is above the wire and below the application is what the statement was when I first started working in the IETF. And that meant we didn't do wires. Ethernets or T1s or that sort of stuff, that's somebody else's problem. And we didn't tell you how to do user interfaces. Well, actually, we did a little bit. The FTP document says what has to be on the screen and things. But basically, we didn't do that. But things are a little fuzzy now, because wires are no longer what used to be wires. We can imitate an Ethernet over IP or over MPLS. So now you can have IP running over Ethernet, which is running over IP, which is running over SONET, which is running over IP, which is running over MPLS. Where is the reality anymore? There's no reality there, so we can't really easily say it's above the wire because we're making fake wires. The fake wires that look just like real wires and actually can't be told, the difference can't be told. And so the IETF in that area is very fuzzy. We take input from our community. You have somebody has a good idea, they convince the area director, and the area director's the ISG gets convinced, they produce a working group, creates a document, creates standards, etc. We do that based on what people are interested in. Well, some of the stuff people have been interested in is telephony. Telephony is fun. It's only a $3 trillion a year business, so maybe it's something interesting there. So the IETF went off and did some telephony stuff. Well, there's other standards bodies in the world that think they know telephony, like the ITU, for example. So the IETF creating telephony standards, and the this is ITU's traditional field. Now what? Well, things get a little tense. So many other standards bodies are seeing their entire reason of existence has been overtaken by the internet. Now, some of that we want to take some responsibility for here, to say that we did things in such a way that it enabled that takeover. Other stuff, it would just happen because entrepreneurs thought this was a good idea, and because wires got faster, things like that. But many of those other standards bodies are fearing for their future. Here's the IETF usurping their responsibilities and redefining what they think is voice or video or whatever. And so the IETF is constantly in a tension with other standards bodies. This has been much more so in the last 5 to 10 years than it was before the internet was a success. Back before then, the internet was just a toy. Geeks played with it, but nobody really used it. In fact, a fellow from IBM came to Harvard. I work at Harvard. And a fellow from IBM research came to Harvard back about 10 years ago and said, quote, "The internet does not work," end of quote. And after a bunch of discussion, figured out what he actually meant was, because you couldn't define what work meant. What does work mean? I hand a packet to the ISP and the ISP delivers it 37% of the time? Is that what work means? Because you can't define what work means, of course it can't be working. You have to have a definition, but that seems to be very silly to me. But that was IBM's formal position at the time. But we have a lot of problems with some other standards bodies where you will see some tensions around here this week, most likely. We'd like to get past them because they're a pain. They're an energy sink. We went through a decade of fighting between the OSI protocols and the TCP/IP protocols where there was parallel development activities and there was a huge money sink and energy sink. But in the end, the IETF and the IP protocols won, but it had such a cost. It was a huge amount of money, and it was certainly sad. We don't want to get going that again, but that's coming along. That's what's happening. So that's the background. So here's the IETF. The stuff in green is the IETF. The things around it are around it. They're associated in one way or another, but the basic IETF is the stuff in green. We'll go through these. I mentioned the Internet Society. The IETF agreed to become under the IETF, under the Internet Society's wing back in, I forget when it was, 96 or something like that. The Internet Society was formed in 92, so it took that length of time for the IETF to agree to be under the wing. But now the Internet Society is our economic home. It's where all the budgets flow. It's where the people that put on this show is really IETF employees. And so it's very important, ISG employees. The IETF actually only has no employees. There's one Internet Society employee that's designated for the IETF directly, and that's the IAD, the Administrative Director. But everything else is just, we're volunteers, and we'll go into that. There are people being paid in Secretariat and the like, but the Internet Society was formed originally to be a legal umbrella over the IETF, but it took, as I say, the IETF a long time to agree to that, to pick up the umbrella, and also to continue some developing country workshops that Larry Lendweber had set up. It was pretty good work, and the Internet Society still does some of that. The Internet Society right now is dedicated to try and explaining the Internet way to the people that are trying to figure out the future direction for standardization for the Internet. There's a lot of work going on with that with the ITU right now. So 96 was when the IETF agreed to come under the umbrella so it's 4 years after the Internet Society was formed. It is the legal home. We do buy insurance so that the working group chairs, the management are all covered by insurance. And it has other formal roles. Internet Research Task Force, when the IETF was formed, IETF was one of a number of task forces. The IRTF was the other one which still exists. The IETF works on things which can be standardized, things that are well enough known that you can write down, here's how you do them. The IRTF works on things for the future that we don't know enough yet. So, for example, there's an anti-spam research group. We do not know how to fix spam. That's an absolute certainty. We do not know how to fix spam. So that's research. That's not secure. That's not standards. It's really research. And there's a bunch of them. There's a whole pile of different research groups. Most of these, I think actually all of the IRTF groups now are open. There was a time when some of them were closed, invitation only, because they were cutting edge research. But mostly I think these are all open now. Some of them will meet this week. You can get on the mailing list for any of them and watch it and participate. The chair of the IRTF is appointed by the IAB, and it's Lars Ergert. IAB, I mentioned, they got kicked out of being the authority, the standards approval body, but are still a very important role, play a very important role in the IETF. They provide architectural oversight, giving general direction on what's good architecture and what's bad architecture. They review working group charters and provide advice there. They're in the audience and provide advice from the audience in many environments. They also have the formal relationship with external bodies and the RC editor, and they'll talk about more of those. Here's some of the ways the IAB provides its oversight. So, back a long time ago, back in the late 60s, along came this group that got together to make protocols. This was long before the IETF made protocols. When you do protocols, you have fields in protocols. It doesn't make any difference what the number is. It's not vanity plates, like vanity license plates, but it's a number. If that number is, if I send you a packet with a number in it, I need you to know what that means. Like, it means it's email, or it means it's World Wide Web. There needs to be some definition of what that number means, and there has to be some registry of those numbers. That registry was the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. That was John Postel, a person. John Postel was the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. And he kept track of what those numbers meant. And he would assign them, but they didn't mean it. They had no meaning other than what they were used for. Everybody had to agree what they were. They didn't matter what they actually were, as long as everybody agreed. So 25, that's email, period. And that's what John did. And then, this was pre-Internet Protocol. Along comes the Internet Protocol. DidSurf, Bob Kahn, others came up with this concept of the Internet Protocol, IP. IP had addresses. Before that, there were addresses, but they were of INPs. They were of basically routers. So along came this idea of a 32-bit address. And somebody had to keep track of who got what address. Again, it didn't make any difference what they were, because there was no vanity plates. Number 1, 2, 3, 4, I mean, you could get that, but who cared? Nobody looked at it. So somebody had to record that. John started taking notes and keeping track of who got assigned what numbers. Then, a little later on, it became clear that telling people what your IP address was was a loser, because it's random numbers, and trying to keep track of random numbers is a real pain. So Paul Markopetros came up with this idea of mapping user-friendly names into numbers, the domain name system. So harvard.edu. Two big advantages. One, you don't have to remember the numbers, because they were kind of pain to do. 128.103.8.36. That was my machine at home, at my office at Harvard for many years. It's no longer, it's something else. Machine name is the same, but the number is different. Because the second advantage of using domain name system is that the numbers can be short-lived, but the name's long-lived. You keep changing what actual computer you're using, but with keeping the same name. So somebody had to keep track of who had what name. John Postel did all of this. He also was the main editor of RFCs. So John Postel did everything. He was a pretty amazing guy. But he was the IANA for a very long time. He then evolved that into a group at ISI who was doing that, and then finally into an external corporation, which is now known as ICANN. The IANA well predates the IETF. But ICANN is the institutionalizing, as John put it, of the IANA function. So this is now in a private corporation. It does the top of the pyramid on domain names, on IP addresses, and does the registry of protocol values. The IETF is no longer in the IP address business other than for special things, specially assigned things for experiments and things like that. It's no longer in the domain name business except for the same exceptions. We've got example.com. That comes from an RFC, where the IETF said that here's what we want you to use in documentation. So now the IANA functionality is done by ICANN, and the IETF has a memorandum of understanding with ICANN for the portion of the ICANN functionality, the IANA functionality, that we care about, which is protocol assignments. So while that is tremendously important, the IANA is tremendously important, it is not part of the IETF per se. But we do have this IETF IANA, which does our protocol values. So we got managers. Any organization has 10 managers. So what's the managers in the IETF? We have a chair, the IETF chair, Russ Housley right now. We've got area directors. I already mentioned them. They're managers of areas, 2 per area, except for the general area. There's just 1 in the general area. That's the chair's area. Internet Engineering Steering Group, which is the area director sitting as a body, the IAB, and then others. We'll get to some of the others. These are chosen by the community. These are not chosen by the IETF chair, as they once were. After 1992 and that palace revolt that we had, we moved to an environment where we have a nominations committee, which consists of volunteers from the community, and they choose the management. They're all volunteers. They get paid by their companies. The IETF does not pay them. Other than the guy standing in the back there, he's the IAB. That's Ray. Wave your hand, Ray. He's our one employee. I mentioned him earlier. He's an employee actually of the Internet Society, but he's directly our one employee. The secretariat also gets paid, but they're a contractor. But the IETF does not pay the working group chairs, the ISG members, the IETF chair, the IAB members. We don't pay their salary. We don't pay their expenses. Very occasionally, some ISG member or IAB member will get into financial difficulty and will be supported for 1 or 2 meetings, but that's it. But only supported in the expenses case. Very, very rare. It's almost always that their companies are paying for this, or they're paying themselves, paying for it themselves. They're paying their own expenses. So this is a big deal, particularly the chair. The IETF chair is mostly a full-time job, and the chair is paid for by their company. or gets external support for it. It's not the IETF producing that support. The Russ Housley is the chair, as I mentioned. One of the previous chairs said that the IETF chair is the IETF CTO, Chief Traveling and Talking Officer. They have no particular authority over the standards process. The IETF chair does not have any stronger voice in a working group session than you do. You can come in and provide a good cognizant reason that the IETF chair is full of it. Do so, because he may be. He's full of himself, and he's very sure of himself, but he's not always right. And others have pointed that out. But that's fine. Picked by NOMCOM. Area directors. Again, they're picked by NOMCOM. Their job is to manage the area, help decide when to create working groups, help decide whether working groups are doing their job. But they don't have the authority to say, this is how the technology should work. That's the community. That's the working group members themselves. But the area directors do a technical review of any documents brought up to them for advancement under the standards track. The ISG does this cross-area technical review. I already mentioned this. This is something that's very different in the IETF than in most standards bodies. Most standards bodies, the further you get up in the management, the more the management is of process. Was the process followed? Was this number of last calls done? Were this number of votes taken? That's not the way this works. The ISG does a cross-area technical review of any proposal. Security area directors review it for security things. Transport area directors review it for congestion control. The other areas, O&M areas, review it for manageability. They review the document cross-area. So the ISG can take it down and say, hey, this doesn't make any sense. You can't manage it. Try again. Send it back to the working group for more work. Which is, again, it's very unusual in standards bodies. Mostly the higher level ones just say, was the right process followed? So how do we select the management? So anybody can nominate people for these various positions. You're now participants in the IETF. You can nominate people. If you got a good nominee, do it, because they're going to be calling for nominees very soon. But anybody can nominate. The people that are on the nominations committee, the people who volunteer in the nominations committee, there's a little limit to that, in that you have to have been at a number of IETF meetings in order to know enough about how the IETF works, in order to be seen as competent for the nominations committee. But you can nominate anybody. Anybody can nominate anybody. They don't have to be somebody that's in the IETF. So if somebody who's not participating in the IETF is unlikely to get a whole lot of support on the nomination committee as to have a role in the IETF. It can happen, it has happened, but it's not general. The nominated, so people volunteer for being on the NOMCOM. And right now I think there's 120-ish or something like that. Can you look that up? How many nominees, how many volunteers that are, we're right in the cycle right now where the call for volunteers for the NOMCOM has gone out. And we've got 100-ish or something like that. Volunteers. Then there'll be a selection process to choose 10 members of the NOMCOM from that. The initial selection process was to take a hat, take a little piece of paper with people's names in them, put it in the hat, take it to the local priest to pick out the NOMCOM members. But that was seen as much too potentially biased. I don't know what they thought of their local priest that made them think that there was bias. But so Don Eastway came up with this RFC 3777. Came up with a different RFC. Well, it's a different RFC, which specifically comes up with an incredibly off-the-wall randomization process to ensure a random selection process. You pick the number of stocks that are going to be sold in different companies at some point in the future, and use them as a seed for a random number generator. This is random. This is random over the top. But there's no question of bias. There's no bias there. So these are the areas. I've mentioned those already. General area doesn't currently have any working groups, but if you have we had working groups that are worrying about intellectual property rights, they'd be in the general area. Or working groups that are worrying about the standards process definitions itself would be in there. 74 volunteers for the non-com, so we need more. Applications area, so this was as of 2.5 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. This is the split up. So, for example, the Internet area has 25 and real-time activities area has 29. That's a lot of working groups for those two area directors to manage. Secretariat, you'll see them wandering around, the Secretariat folks wandering around. They are contract. We wrote a contract for them through the Internet Society, and they're paid for their work, and they're the ones that actually put on the meeting here. They get paid for that. The IASA. The IASA is a group that's partially chosen by the non-com, partially chosen by the Internet Society and others, and partially made up of people who have roles in the IAB, the ISG, and the Internet Society. And they're worried about things like what the budget is, where we're going to meet next time, that sort of stuff, how long the days are, that sort of managerial type functionality. They have absolutely no authority over the standards process. If somebody on the IASA, and I happen to be on the IASA, if somebody's on the IASA and they think that this is a really dumb or a really great idea technically, it don't make a difference. We have no say whatsoever in that. That's entirely at the working group and then the ISG level. The IAD, who's Ray, who was the guy who was back in the room a little while ago, he's the employee, the main employee. The oversight committee, this is the committee of the IASA, which is the committee I was just mentioning. The IETF trust, any kind of standards bodies creates IPR, intellectual property rights, copyrights on the RFCs themselves and things like that, and software that's created as part of the contracts for the Secretariat service and for other things. There has to be a home for that intellectual property right. So that is the IETF trust. It's a separate legal entity which holds this intellectual property rights. It holds it for the IETF. It can't go off and sell it or something. It's only within the IETF. And we'll get back to somewhat the intellectual property rights towards the end. See what that means. You'll see that many of us wear dots. I've got two different dots on here. You can't tell the difference, but one's purple and one's blue. So I'm a working group chair, so I have blue dot. I'm a member of the IAOC, so I've got a purple dot. If you're an IAB member, you got a red dot. They're actually very visible across the room. I was on the ISG for a decade, and it was very nice because you get yellow dots, which you can't see from more than about 4 feet away. So nobody could really tell that you were an ISG member. Since they're the ones that actually get things done, it meant you had a little bit more free time. Non-com is orange and localhost is green. Fred Baker once had, I think, 4 different color dots because he was ISG chair, the IETF chair, which meant he was a working group chair in addition, and he was on the IAB because he was the IETF chair. He was on the ISG because he was the IETF chair. So those 3, and Cisco was the local host, so it was 4. And he said that this was not an indication of sanity, but it was an indication of busyness. And the smiley faces here, you will find that almost everybody at the IETF is very eager to help. But these are people who have specifically volunteered to be eager to help. So if you have some question, go ask them, but ask anybody. Mostly will be nice to you. As mentioned already, the working groups is where the work is done. It's not done in smoke-filled rooms someplace. Actually, no smoking in most of these environments that we read in these days. But it's done in working group sessions. Working group sessions, working groups. Not just working group sessions, but working groups. Most of the work of the working group is done on the mailing list. It's not done in these sessions. You'll see that these meetings, like this week, will have 50 or 100 working group meetings. But any particular one might be for an hour and a half or 2 hours. You can't write standards in an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 times a month, 3 times a year. So the main work has to be done elsewhere. The main work is done on the mailing list. The face-to-face meetings are for understanding what new work might want to be added or to resolve big issues where the high bandwidth face-to-face communication helps. But the work itself is done on the mailing list. All the final decisions are made on the mailing list. They're not made at a meeting like this. So you can participate completely fully within the IETF without ever coming to one of these meetings. You'll find it sociable and nice to come, but you don't have to be here in order to be a full participant in the IETF. A number of people who have produced some very significant standards have never been to an IETF meeting other than the one that met in their hometown. They just don't travel. It's a bottoms-up thing. I mentioned that already, that it's very rare that the management comes in and says, I want to work a group on some topic. It's a bottoms-up where a group of people get together and say, I think this is good stuff. Maybe starts off with one person writing a document that gets people enthused, but it starts from the bottom. This makes it very difficult for the IETF to agree to do things. That's just one of our issues with other standards bodies, is we can't go in and then say, okay, yeah, we'll do that for you. We'll develop that technology, because we don't have a way to tell the worker bees, how to do that. It's from the bottoms up. It's people locally individuals who want to work on something get that going. We can't create the working groups out from on top, which some bodies can. We can't do that. We generally have a birds of a feather session as the first meeting. The birds of a feather session it's not required. We don't always have one, but it's really a way, and it's also, if we have a birds of a feather session, it doesn't always develop into a working group. It could simply be a one-time thing which just provides information for the community. But it also could develop into a working group. But we can have a working group without a birds of a feather session. But the primary reason, if where we're going to develop from birds of a feather session into a working group, so the area director can look at the community and see whether there's enough worker bees, enough people interested in the technology to develop the technology. If it's only one or two people, then that's not a working group activity. It's an individual activity. But if you've got a bunch of people, 50 people who are interested in the technology and are interested in working on it, then you can create a working group. The other thing that a birds of a feather session is used for is to determine whether there's a direction that the community feels that it should go in. So, for example, I had a birds of a feather session once. There was about 300 people in the room. It was a well-attended meeting, well-attended session. And I asked at the end, I got up as area director and got up at the end and said, okay, how many people think this should be an IETF working group? And about half the people in the room put their hand up, saying they think so. Now, that's great, but then I asked the other question. How many people think it should not be an IETF working group? And the other half put their hands up. So we did not form the working group, because there wasn't a direction that people wanted to go in. Now note that when you ask a question like, how many people think X, and half the room reacts, that's unusual. Mostly it's 10% or 20% of the room. We just don't get that. Because a lot of people are sitting there watching, trying to understand, and they're not ready to express an opinion yet. But we'll get back to that in a second. There's also another reason that people don't express opinions. So working group. To create a working group, the ISG comes up with a charter, works with the area director, works with the people who are going to be the chairs of the working group, chairs of the working group, and creates a charter. A charter is a set of thou shalts and thou shalt nots. Here's the things you should work on, here's what the milestones are and the targets are, and here are the things you should not work on. It's restrictive. A working group is supposed to work on a particular set of problems and not go outside of that. It's not a grab bag and can go anywhere. That's quite restrictive. And so you'll frequently in a meeting, in a session, hear somebody say, yeah, but that would be a great idea, but it's not in the charter. They can go back to the ISG and get the charter extended, but initially, if it's not in the charter, then the working group's not supposed to work on it. So The working group chairs, area director, ISG, work together, come up with a charter, publish that charter publicly, not only to the IETF, but to other standards bodies as well. It's a mailing list that goes to many other standards bodies around the world, so they can see what we think we want to do. And so that they can respond and say, well, we're already working in this area, we'd like you to work with us. Or please don't work on that because we're already working on it. Now, generally we don't not work on something just because somebody else is, but we will work with somebody else if they're working on something in the same general area. We certainly will try and coordinate at some level. Sometimes, occasionally, we will form a joint working group. We've done that with the ITU, we've done that with W3C. Develop a joint working group, develop a joint text. So the two different standards bodies come up with one standard. But just as often, we'll look at it and say, well, yeah, that's great, but what you're doing is in this direction, and what we want to do is in this direction. It's a different philosophical approach. And they're competing, and the competition's good. So we won't stop working on something simply because somebody else is working on it. And we don't expect them to not work on something that we're working on. A technology. Not in the area that we're running into trouble with other standards bodies is they'll take an IETF technology, like the Internet Protocol, and then fix it, make it better in some way. That we don't think is a good idea, nor would we want to take somebody else, some other standards body's technology like Ethernet, and fix it, make it better. If it's their technology, then the work on that technology should be done there. And if it's our technology, the work should be done here. But that's an area of tension. Working groups are closed down when their work's done, which actually is a tremendous shock to some people, particularly come from, well, first of all, that everybody ever gets anything done, but also people who come from other standards bodies. If you're a working group chair and you get your stuff done, they give you more to do, because it's an honor to be a working group chair. Well, we don't consider it an honor, we consider it a duty. So I was, as area director, I shut down a working group, and the person was just mortified. He'd done a great job. He got everything done. The charter was fulfilled, and I shut it down. And he was just terrified, because he would have to go back to his boss and say he was fired. No, you succeeded. But it was a difficult message, but it's a message that's there. It's part of the way we work. So here's the visual on the flow that may have the birds of a feather session, come up with a charter, area director, ISD, goes out to the community, the general community, the other standards bodies can react to the charter, and then produce a working group. So, working groups. There's no defined membership. You don't say, I'm in working group X. You show up in a meeting, you subscribe to a mailing list, you participate one or another. You talk to people in the corridor. You're participating in a working group. You're not a member of the working group, because we don't have any way of defining what a member is. It's just somebody participating. Rough consensus. As I mentioned before, this means that we're not looking for everybody to be agreeable. Some people can disagree violently, and still the technology will go forward if enough people think it's the right path to take. Sometimes that winds up with having somebody come up with a different technology, a competing standard, even within the IETF. We've had that happen. We don't like it, but it does happen. But it's better than saying that everybody has to agree. When you say everybody has to agree, that means you're a little widget that you will not give up, no matter how many people tell you it's dumb. You're going to insist on having it in there before you're going to agree. And that means we have to put it in. That makes the standards more complicated. Now, I'm not picking on you particularly, but you're there, and you've got the right kind of facial hair. So we don't do that. We do rough consensus, not consensus. And we don't do voting. I talked about doing a show of hands, but I didn't talk about counting. I said about half the people. It was just pure visual. Let's do an experiment. How many people traveled more than 100 miles to get here to this meeting? How many people traveled 100 miles or less? Okay. So the rough consensus in this room is that an IETF meeting is more than 100 miles away. No, I didn't count. There's just a whole lot of people. But now here's a special situation. Let's say you have an opinion, and your boss has an opinion, and they're not the same. Now, if you put your hand up when your boss isn't, and your boss puts your hand up when you don't, that could cause interesting times back at the plant. So you will hear people doing hums. With a hum, you can get an idea of what the majority feels, what the feeling in the room is, without being able to identify who. So let's try that. Hum if you travel more than 100 miles to get here. Hum if you travel less than 100 miles to get here. So it's obvious that the consensus in the room is that it's more than 100 miles away. But you don't know who. So you will see that. We've been derided for that, doing hums. But it actually has a place. It allows you to express an opinion on something where you don't want to be personally identified with expressing that opinion. So we will see that, but if somebody starts counting hands, then that's wrong. If it's a lot of people in favor of strong hum versus a weak hum, then that's the rough consensus. When somebody starts counting, oh yeah, it's 1, 2, 7, 14, 37 hands up and 12 hands up, you shouldn't be doing that. Some working group chairs don't quite get that message, but that's not what they should be doing, because we're not supposed to be looking for a strict vote. If you do a strict majority vote, first of all, not everybody is going to be dealing with it in the room. They're on the mailing list. And second of all, if you've got something that passes 51 to 49, is that good technology? It is unlikely to be good technology. You want something where people are agreed mostly that this is good stuff. And just because it passes 51 to 49 is not likely to be seen as good stuff. It's actually technology. There's enough people that say that's wrong, that there's probably something wrong. So we don't want to do that. And I mentioned on here, all of the final decisions must be made a mailing list, taking into account what was in the room. But the final decision made on a mailing list for people who do not get to the meetings. Now that means that the chair has to decide when we have rough consensus, combination of what happened in the room and what the discussion on the mailing list. It turns out this is hard. It's not at all easy to watch a mailing list and decide when people are agreed, because you get one idiot that types well overwhelms the mailing list. And you have to take that into account and figure that out and figure out how many people he's turned off and have left the mailing list. English is the language of the IETF. Now, there's a blanket permission built into our intellectual property rights that allows anybody who wants to take an IETF document and translate it into any language they want without getting any special permission. Just go do it, and you can publish it. There's no problems at all. But our language is English. That's good, bad, whatever it is, but that's just what it is. It's English. And it is also ASCII. It is plain text. We get derided for that, too, because we can't draw pretty pictures. So we'll say that if you look at some of the older RFCs, you'll see what is called ASCII art, which is little lines and dashes and diagonals. Some of that stuff's really good. Somebody was on really, really good drugs when they did that stuff. But that is our formal definition today. There is an active discussion going on right now on the RFC interest mailing list as to whether we should change that. Well, we can still read RFC 1 from 1969. How many other standards bodies can read something that was made 10 years ago on Word, which is a common mechanism, or Word Perfect for that matter? So one of the issues is something that can be read for 40 years. And that's a significant issue. But that's it's onward going. We're not going to be we're not going to easily deal with that one. The basic process for a standard is you publish a document which is a draft of that standard. It's called an internet draft. Anybody can publish an internet draft. No admissions controls. And if you read some of the internet drafts, you can tell there's no admissions controls. Some of these things are really wacky, completely wacko. One of them proposed a solution to Fermat's theorem, for example. This is really off-the-wall stuff, but a lot of it's very good. But it's individual ideas. Maybe there's 2 or 3 people on it on the author list. Maybe it's just one, but you publish it. That may lead to a working group. It may be input to a working group. It may be just your own work. All of that's fine. You iterate. You get comments on this in the internet draft, and you iterate on it. So there's a 2-digit extension number on there saying what the iteration is. -00, -01, -02. You iterate on it until you get a general feeling it's the right thing. Then you pass it up to the area director. If it's a working group, the working group passes it up to the area director, which does his own review, his or her own review, can kick it back to the working group if the area director doesn't think it's ready. If the area director thinks it's ready, it goes to the ISG. The ISG sends out a message to the IETF community and to the world. A last call. Anybody who wants to can comment on this. If it's a working group document, that's a 2-week period. If it's your individual document, didn't go through a working group, but you got an area director who thinks this is really good stuff, it's a 4-week last call. Then when that period of time is over, the ISG then does its own technical review, gets the input from the last call, and figures out whether it's ready for prime time. If it's ready to be published, then it's sent off to the RFC editor for publication. If it's not, it's then remitted back to the working group for additional work. It's very rare, and I think actually probably too rare, that a document is killed. The ISG actually can't really easily do that, but sometimes some of these things should not see the light of day, but they go on anyway. So that's the basic process. IETF documents are open. Unlike many standards bodies where the working documents are only for members of the organization, since we don't have members, how can we do that? So they're open. Anybody can look. Anybody can read them. Anybody can copy them. Anybody can republish them. If you republish it as an entirety, that's fine. For many years, SRI used to take RFCs, publicly available for free over the ARPANET, bind them up in a book, publish them, burn them on paper, bind them up in a book, and sell them to libraries, because libraries wanted a physical copy. Now, they made money doing that, and that's cool. Didn't bother us at all. The material is still made completely available free. And that's today, too. There are people who make compendiums of RFCs today. One of the more popular ones is a feature of RFCs is that there are some joke RFCs. The 1st of April, occasionally the RFC editor publishes a joke RFC. And somebody's put together all those joke RFCs into a book and selling the book with a preface, but I wrote one of the prefaces to it. And no, I don't get anything for it. The author gets, the editor gets it, so not me. RFCs, so internet drafts are these working documents that you iterate through. RFCs, once they're published, they're there. It's not like Ethernet standard in the IEEE, where it's called the same thing, but it's actually different text every few years. But RFC 123 is RFC 123 and will never change. If we come up with a revision of that document, it's given a new RFC number. So the RFC, once published, is always stays the same. Many different kinds of RFCs. So internet drafts, I talked to you about internet drafts. RFC used to stand for request for comments. It does not anymore, because by the time it gets to be an RFC, it's too late to comment on it. You were supposed to comment during the internet draft phase. So now RFC is a brand name. It's not a request for anything. First RFC is host software, April 7th, 1969, by Steve Crocker, who still comes to the IETF meetings from time to time. He's still somewhat active. He's now chair of ICANN, so he's not likely to be here this week, but he possibly would be. But There are over 6,000 RFCs. I don't know exactly how many. Some of the numbers were not used, so I can't just look at the top number, the biggest number that's there. Some of the RFC numbers were never used. Not all RFCs are standards. There was a period of time when many vendors would say, oh, it's published as an RFC, therefore it's a standard. No, it's published as an RFC because some individual decided to publish it. And it can be handed to the RFC editor and get published as an individual contribution that didn't go through any IETF deliberation at all. Those are not standards. So here are some of them. There are standards, standard track stuff. There's obsoletes. There's requirements. There's process documents. The IETF's process documents are RFCs, experimental history, etc. And then there's the April Fool's Day jobs. The most famous of these is IP over avian carriers. You write your IP packet on a little strip of paper and type it to the leg of a pigeon and send it off. It's got very long round trip times. But it has been implemented. A bunch of folks in England implemented it. And it does work. Well, it's got losses, but. Norway. Yes, speaking from somebody from Norway. But it's been implemented and it does work. It's been upgraded. There was a quality of service one where you paint the pigeon red for faster delivery, and you do not want to know about the audit log. I have a couple of, actually 3 of those in under my name. One of the things you do about the April Fool's Day RFC is you want to make it look real. The first one was the Telnet randomly lose option. John Postel decided to publish that. This was an option where if you turned it on, it would randomly lose characters on your Telnet stream. Not the most useful protocol around, but it was written as if it was completely perfect. It was the real thing. I wrote one of the ones I wrote was the firewall enhancement protocol, which is how you run TCP/IP over HTTP to get through those pesky firewalls. So instead of having to do each individual protocol separately, you just run it over that. And half of the mail I got was wanting implementations. Now, if you read it, it is a complete joke because it was the least efficient protocol anybody ever seen. You're putting TCP over ASCII text strings. But people wanted it. And the other one was the omniscience requirements protocol. This came from our non-beloved Senator Hatch, who wanted to destroy your computer if you were involved in illegal music sharing. Now, I mean, destroy. He was asked specifically, you don't mean destroy? He says, yes, I mean destroy. So if he's going to destroy your computer, he's got to know that that stuff's on there bad. Maybe he snuck the song on your machine. So you have to have an omniscience protocol to be sure that the bad stuff is on your machine for bad reasons. And of course, it has to work when the machine's disconnected, so wormhole routing and things like that. I got slashdotted for that because somehow I was supporting Orrin Hatch, which was perfect. It was absolutely perfect because it meant that people were fooled by it, which is the purpose of one of these things. It's not always done. Not every year is a good enough RFC, a good enough proposal comes along, but some stuff's there. The last one I had was selling naming rights to fields in the IP packets for revenue source. But no one's taken me up on that. RFC editor, that was John Postel, until he died. Basically, he died unfortunately early, but he was the RFC editor. You'll see his name is on many of the core documents, the Internet Protocol, TCP, things like that. Have his name on there as the editor. He oversaw the RFC process up until when he died. Now it is a separate RFC editor function, which is paid for by the Internet Society. And it's a formal process, takes Internet drafts from the ISG, the IAB, ISG for the IETF, the IAB for itself, the IRTF chair for the IRTF, and publishes in RFCs. And then there is a separate path, which is the independent stream path. So if you get this great idea and you want to publish it as you want to publish it as an RFC, you can write an Internet draft, iterate with your friends, come up with something that you think is great, send it off to the RFC editor. the independent stream editor, and say, I'd like to publish this as an independent submission. It can be published as informational or experimental document. It can't be published as standard. It's got a label on it. The first thing the independent stream editor does is send it off to the ISG saying, is the ISG interested in this? Because maybe this stuff is actually good. In which place the ISG would reach out to you and say, would you like to have a working group about that? Because maybe it's good stuff. Well, the ISG might look at it and say, that's really pretty dumb. In which case they'll let it go. And the RSC, the independent stream editor, with a body that he has to help him, will try and figure out whether it's worth publishing. But it's a safety valve that allows people who don't get stuff done in the IETF standards process to still publish information for the community. Sometimes that's because it's a vendor publishing their own technology. Sometimes it's a proposal was made to a working group and the working group didn't support it. They went off to do something else instead. So here's a picture for that. The regular IETF submission comes in through either a working group or an individual into the ISG, goes out to the community for last call review, back to the ISG, and then maybe off to the RFC editor for publication. And then the IETF, the independent stream editor, can do the same thing, except can only publish informational or experimental RFCs, not standards. Now, we used to have a three-step standards process. We don't anymore. This was changed last year. Now, the reason it was changed was that the three steps were a proposed standard, a draft standard, and a full standard. But almost nothing ever moved out of the proposed standard area. It was fully developed standard. And in fact, a proposed standard in the IETF was approximately equivalent to a final standard out of most standards bodies, which is, we don't know of any faults. It's good stuff. We believe it's good stuff. It doesn't have any known flaws, but we haven't necessarily implemented it. That's what comes out of most standards bodies. Well, that was our first step. But so let's say you were a working group, you're an editor, and you write this wonderful document. And it gets adopted by the working group and approved by the ISG. It gets published as an RFC, and people start implementing it and working, and it's great, and it's deployed, and everybody's using it. What's your incentive to go back and do more work on it to make it into the next stage, next further up in the standards process? None. You don't get any more brownie points unless your company gives you some. You don't have any more, the document, the stuff's out there being implemented, and that's what you're concerned with. So there wasn't enough incentive for people to keep working on things after they succeeded. You succeeded and get it published, okay, that's good enough, let's move on to the next technology, the next good stuff. So the powers that be and then the community support and say, oh, it's too hard to do three steps, so we'll do two. Now, I'm one that actually felt that made no difference at all, because still the incentive is not to move once you've done all the work. You've done the work, it's published, and people are using it, why go do more work in order to get just a nicer title on it, because it's still the same document, it's still the same technology. But we now have a two-step standards process. For the standards track, there's the proposed standard and internet standard. The draft standard was taken out, but the internet standard has succumbed to various implementation requirements that was in the old draft standard requirement, which is multiple interoperable implementations. Now, why would you want to insist that people implement the software, implement technology, before you call it the next more proven version of the standard? It is not to show that the technology works, which is the immediate assumption is, well, you want to make sure it works. No. The reason to have multiple interoperable implementations is to ensure that the specification is clear. So if you implement the specification and you implement the specification and they can interoperate, that means the specification must have been clear. It doesn't mean that it doesn't anything useful, but it must have been clear. And if it doesn't interoperate, that means there's something wrong with the specification, and you go back and you work on the specification. So the running code was not to ensure, Dave Clark's original running code requirement, was not to ensure that the technology actually worked. to ensure the specifications are clear. And we talk about interoperability. A lot of standards bodies talk about conformance, standards conformance, to conform to a standard. I don't care whether you conform to the standard. I care whether you interoperate. You may conform to your reading of the standard. You may conform to your reading of the standard. You may even conform to the reading of the standard that the vendor you use to test your conformance believes in, and you may conform to the version that your vendor believes in. That doesn't mean they talk to each other, which means they're useless. So we're pushing on interoperability. Anybody here dealt with the X400 standards? A few people want to admit that. There was almost no interoperability there because, among other, the standards were okay, clarity-wise, but there were too damn many options. No two people implemented the same set of options. So we want fewer options, we want more clarity, and no, the standards weren't great, but they were doable, but not wonderful. The other RFC types are informational, experimental, historical. But we really do run on proposed standards because people get that done and they move on to doing something else. But look at the standard. The document may be superseded. Remember that the RFC has never changed once published. So just looking at the RFC itself doesn't help you. You have to go look at the index. The index will tell you what the status is. It may tell you that this RFC has been obsoleted by another one or been declared historical. When it's been declared historical, that usually means there's something bad. If you do this, it will hurt. So don't do it. So like RIP version 1. That will not interoperate with the modern internet because RIP version 1 doesn't deal with classless addresses. So there's a document, there's an RFC that says this is declared historic. Don't do it. It's a red flag. But look at the index to find out what the current status is. Any standards body worth its salt has to have an appeals process. So you put in a proposal and your working group chair looks at it and says, yeah, or finer words to that effect. You don't agree with that analysis, so you can appeal that. You can appeal that to the ISG. And if you don't like the results there, you can appeal that, the ISG results, to the IAD. And if you think the standards process itself is broken, then you can appeal that to the ISOC Board of Trustees. No one's ever appealed the ISOC Board of Trustees. I like to think it's because I wrote the standards process well, but I don't know. I think it's just people give up the ghost at that point. But we have had many appeals. It's a good year when we don't have any, but we've probably had a dozen or maybe 24 appeals since this appeals process was written, and about half succeed. That the ISG tells the working group they did the wrong thing, or the IAB tells the ISG they did the wrong thing. And so this is a valid appeals process that actually works. But you need this in order for fairness. You need to be able to deal with the apparent bias of a working group chair or document editor or an ISG member. And it's a very important thing to be able to deal with. All right, so you're here, starting tomorrow, there'll be a working group sessions. Working group session, like in this room, this will be a working group meeting in this session here. It'll meet in the morning sessions, take 2.5 hours, the afternoon ones as short as an hour. So it's only for the big issues. I mentioned that already, only for the big issues. The agenda for the session should list, they don't always do it, but they should list what internet drafts are going to be discussed at the meeting. You should read those. Or you can come and just watch. But if you come and comment, please read first. Speak with question with knowledge rather than with ignorance. Read, listen to the discussions, then ask. Read the documents, then ask. So, but be involved. This is not asking you not to be involved. But look at the documents before, as the old saying goes, don't make people think you're a fool rather than opening your mouth and proving it. So think first, then comment. But do comment. There's microphones in the room, like the microphones in the center here. All of these sessions are streamed. the audio streamed out to the world, and those audio streams are archived. Whenever you go to the microphone to speak, say your name. The people out there in audio land do not know it's the same person standing there because they can't see you. And the person taking minutes won't know. No, we don't have any eyes in the sky yet. We're working on that. But the person taking minutes is not looking at the microphone. They're looking at the keyboard taking minutes. So say your name every time. And please, pretend to like the microphone. Don't look at the guy who asked you the question. Look at the front and talk into the microphone. It's amazing. Geeks don't know how to use microphones. You know, the microphone's here and they talk over here. If you put your thing on here, if you do this and you talk over here, nobody can hear you. So, say straight ahead, talk to the microphone, love the microphone. It's a good thing. Well, sort of good thing. Every time you say, and note, as one of the things you did agree to when you signed up for this, is your voice will be recorded. If you speak in a microphone, it'll be recorded and it'll be archived and people can go get it. And then there's these blue sheets. We don't have one in this room, but the blue sheets are in every session. They're part of the openness of the standards process. We want to know who's in the room. In order to be able to, this comes back from many, many years of litigation over many, many decades, not involving the IETF. Part of the standards process, openness of the standards process is knowing who's participating, who's part of the discussion period, who's sitting there listening. Sign the blue sheets. Make them as legible as you can. They're not, actually the old rules are they were never published. They were put in archives, and if we had a lawsuit, which we a subpoena to deliver them, we had to deliver them, and we definitely did that. The new rules, I think, may be in effect for this meeting, in which case the blue sheets are scanned in and they're made public, but there's no email address on it. If you see there's an email address field, then that's working under the old rules. If the new rules have taken effect, then there won't be an email address column. And that's just, but we do need to have your name for the openness of the process. You can't have invisible people. The final kind of topic is intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights fall into two categories. One is copyrights, and the other is patents. Both things are big things in the standards process, not just the IETF, but all standards processes. Copyrights are confusing. Many standards bodies, or at least some standards bodies, require you to hand over all rights to a document when you hand it in for part of the processing. We don't require that. If you write an internet draft and you give it in, we require you to give us the rights to publish it. Otherwise, why give it in? It wouldn't make any sense at all. So we require you to give us the rights to publish it. And require you to give us the rights to further develop this under the Internet Standards process. Unless if you mark on it that you do not give those rights. You can mark it so that it can be published only as an internet draft. You can mark it so you can say we can't make derivative works, modify it. Why would you do that? Well, maybe you have your own technology that you want to make available to the community, but you don't want them to fix it because it's my technology. It's what I'm shipping in products. But that might be useful to the community. So you can mark it that way. And with the independent stream, you can get it published as an RFC. Within the IETF standards process, you can't actually publish something we can't make derivative rights on within the IETF process. So that's on the copyright side. You can then take that document. You've given us the rights to publish it. You can do anything else you want with it. You can give it to one of the standards bodies. You can turn it into the great American novel, or the great Canadian novel, or the great Bulgarian or Finnish novel, or whatever. You can do anything you want with it, except deny us the rights to publish it, once you've provided that. Patents, on the other hand, are very complicated. Patents turned out to be extremely annoying, but they're important. They're important ways to push technology. But we've had all these fights. The W3C now will not standardize something where they have any known proprietary patent rights which haven't been openly licensed. But who knows? Most of the patent claims come from people who are not involved in the standards process. Not all, but most of them. They just come out of left field. British Telecom comes in and says, we own the rights to URLs, which they did a few years back. The courts disagreed with that, and they were shut down, but still they did that. What happens if I claim that I have a patent on the stuff that you introduced? And my purpose in doing that is to derail your efforts. Because maybe I'm reading my patent broad. Maybe I'm lying. So I want to derail your efforts to get that thing standardized because it competes with my product. So maybe it's a falsehood. What do we do? What do we do? Well, one thing you can say is, well, let's not deal with it. Don't deal with patents. Well, that's actually pretty hard. Here are two patents. Real patents. One on the left, U.S. Patent 5443036, is a method patent for exercising a cat. It's a verified, bona fide U.S. patent. Person, 12, sits with handheld device 10, shines invisible beam of light 14, creates spot on floor 22, which cat chases, cat 20 chases. This is a method patent for using a laser pointer to exercise a cat. How the hell can something like that get through the patent office? I don't know, but it did. The one on the right is the circular transportation facilitation device. This is an Australian innovation patent. Australia, a few years back, decided they didn't have enough patents. Most people think we have plenty of patents, but the Australian government felt, the Australian legislature felt there wasn't enough patents. So they came up with this idea of an innovation patent, which basically is, if it hasn't been patented in Australia before, you can patent it. To show how stupid an idea this was, a newspaper reporter put in a patent application on the wheel, like the thing you have on your car and wagons. And this is a diagram out of that patent application. And it was granted. Now, you can't do a whole lot with an innovation patent, but you do have a patent for the wheel. I got a letter from somebody, some lawyer in Australia a few years back when I was the outside vice president of standards and formal contact for the IETF, saying that they patented the internet and they were going to be sending us bills soon. When we got this kind of environment going on, you don't have any option of not having patents. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of patents issued every year. And so it's there. It's part of the woodwork. So how do you deal with that? Basically, with the IETF, what we've done, we're trying to figure out how to make it so that we know when we're screwed. When we know when somebody has a patent on a technology. That doesn't mean that we won't pass that technology. It means we want to know about it. So the primary requirement is disclosure. So you propose this technology. And part of that proposed technology is something you have put a patent application in on, or your company has. You need to tell us that. Working group can then look at it and say, yeah, but that's really good stuff. And then the licensing fees are probably not going to be too much, and it's worth it, and adopt it. Or they can say, oh, you know, we got another path here which may not be quite as good, but we know we don't have somebody saying they have a patent on it. And so we'll take that path. But the working group gets a chance to talk about it. So if you have a patent application or a patent on anything where you are proposing it, either in a internet draft or a mailing list message or at the microphone, you are proposing your technology, which has a patent on it or a patent application, tell us about it. File it at IPR disclosure. If you find your technology in a application, in a contribution, mailing list message, internet draft, or speaking on a microphone, from somebody who works with your company, then your company's going to have to tell us about it. If you see your technology in somebody else's application, in somebody else's contribution, and you're going to discuss it, you're going to say, yeah, that's a great idea, then you're going to tell us about it. If you're going to sit on your hands and do nothing, then you don't have to tell us about it, but we'd really rather you did. So if you're participating, and by participating means you're trying to influence in any way the discussion on that particular technology, then you must disclose. And if you're not participating but just sitting there, you don't have to disclose, but we really like you to. And the next generation of the standards process may say that you must. May say you must. Most working groups tend to want to go to technologies where there are no known IPR issues. That doesn't mean there are no IPR issues. It just means we don't know about them. Could be somebody sitting there watching it, somebody outside the IETF standards process. And so that's what these various things examples are, the ones I just walked through. Copyright's already talked about, which is once you give it to us, once you give us the text, then you're giving us permission to publish it and to make derivations, derivative works, as long as you don't tell us not to. But you get to keep and make use of it any way you want. Finally, there's the note, which you had to click through when signing up to get into to register for this meeting. And this basically says what a contribution is. And it's anything you say or write in this meeting, as long as it's been intended to basically affect the standards process. If it's not intended to affect the standards process, if it's you and your other people from your company getting together in the bar, then that's not a contribution. But if they then come back from the bar and buttonhole the working group chair or the document editor and tell them how a wonderful idea this technology is, that's a contribution. So that's the IETF, and it's the intellectual property rights and all of that kind of stuff, a little bit of history. You are in the newcomers session at 1300 to 1450. There are some other sessions going on later on today. Two different ones, introduction IETF tools, two introduction IETF tools and the security training. Then there's a 4 o'clock, 1600 hours reception for newcomers, people with a badge on the newcomers, and that's including that the working group chairs will be coming to that, the area director will be coming to that. So if you're interested in a particular working group activity, look for the handwritten badge saying what working groups somebody's a chair of, and you can buttonhole them to find out more about their particular activity. And then there's a welcome reception at 5 o'clock. And finally, there's a newcomers dinner. It's a voluntary thing. It's not formally set up, but if you send mail to this person, they'll tell you when to get together in order to informally go off and find out what you've learned on your first day, because they usually happen Monday afternoon. So what you find out on your first day and what questions you might have. What's next? Be part of it. You're here, you came all this way, according to the came all this way to get here, so be part of this. Be part of the community. Help us create great technology. Help us make this internet thing work better in the future than it is now. Be more of an effect on the world. Read the drafts, read the documents, discuss with friends, discuss with people you don't know yet. Look for common ground. Don't say your way or the highway. Just look for common ways to make things better. And don't settle for second rate. We got this far for some very, very bright people doing some very, very good work, not settling for second best. Any questions? Yeah, why don't you use the microphone? Start off with your name.
My name is Saurabh. I'm from India. And